Or good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Data Talks. Today we are joined by Julia Reinhardt, who is an international strategy consultant for tech and policy, and currently also a fellow at the Mozilla Foundation. Today we will talk about EU regulations like the General Data Regulation Protection (GDPR), and discuss EU regulatory activity, but then from a US perspective. Esther Hoyer will lead today's discussion, and we will record the session, put it on YouTube afterwards, and promote it on our channels, so stay tuned for that. If nothing else, I would like to give the floor to you, Esther and Julia.
Great, thank you, Ray. And welcome to you, Julia. I'm very happy to welcome you today to our Data Talks on behalf of the Support Center for Data Sharing and the European Data Portal. At the Support Center for Data Sharing, we look at how to share data in an ethical way, in a legally compliant way, a technical feasible way, and a viable way. And at the European Data Portal, we make the open data from European countries and institutions available, support the countries and institutions with publishing this data, and also help the community of reusers to understand and leverage the potential of open data. Today, we are of course also going to talk about data policy beyond Europe today for a change. So I'm very excited to hear more about what, Julia, you can tell us today. How did it happen that you are involved in the field of data strategy and data regulation between EU and the US?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Well, so I am a fellow in residence with the Mozilla Foundation and also a privacy professional. And I came to the US 9 years ago as a German diplomat. I was in diplomacy for almost 15 years for Germany. And so when I worked in San Francisco, of course, my main task was to cover relations to tech companies. And so this is what you do here, which is really very exciting because many of those tech companies have a power, an economic power, and almost like a political and societal power that is comparable to some nation states. So right now I wear two hats. My work with the Mozilla Foundation focuses on the regulation of artificial intelligence and how upcoming proposals from Europe will affect US companies, especially here in Silicon Valley. And as a certified privacy professional, that's my other hat. I help US companies comply with European regulation, especially with the General Data Protection Regulation that Ray mentioned and other related policy in the data protection field.
Great. And can you maybe explain to us, why is European regulation important to the US? What is the impact?
Well, so in the case, of course, I mean, these are two very important economic blocks, and the trade among them is essential. It's so big that, of course, anything the other side does in terms of rules is relevant for the other side. But in the case of GDPR, it's even more. GDPR, it applies to companies located in Europe, and that is something that we've always had, of course, also with the directive, the data protection directive that was in place before GDPR. But GDPR also protects all personal data of European residents, no matter where it is handled, in Europe or outside of Europe, in the rest of the world. So that means that US companies, even those without any presence in Europe, have an obligation to protect this personal data when they have users from Europe, because it belongs to those residents. And that means that we as privacy professionals have to make sure that the companies here in the US and all over the world understand what processes need to be involved and what they have to commit to. And so they have to be informed what data protection laws exist in other places of the world, because most of these, I mean, the big companies here have users all over the world. And many of the smaller ones also launch on the European market. So when GDPR became enforceable in 2018, I could witness disbelief, resistance in Silicon Valley. Some companies banned European users from their services out of fear they could get in trouble for non-compliance. And but many US-based companies that process personal data of people around the world have then decided, once they got into what the data management requires, to apply GDPR and extend all the rights that go with it to their customers who are not European residents, but who live outside of Europe. And that is, of course, really relevant. Because to those companies, it gives them an edge in global compliance. It's easier for them in terms of handling complaints and requests, because it's just really difficult on some platforms, for example, to distinguish the locations of users. And so they just say that we just give all of our customers all the rights that Europeans have, which is, of course, in this case, a very high bar. And it's still easier for the organization then to sort out the customer's location and attribute different rights according to their location. And so GDPR kind of offers them a legal framework, a set of standard that is, I mean, at least compared to other legislation around the world that is less spelled out or doesn't exist at all, relatively clearly adoptable. And of course, that was also a big plus for us in the field, because we do have privacy laws in the US. We also have, so on a federal level, there are sectoral ones in the healthcare sector for children and some other sectoral privacy laws, and they need to be implemented, of course. But then also we have privacy laws on state level increasingly, first of all here in California, but then also growing increasingly in other states. And so GDPR is a bit, it's not perfect. It's also not always easy to implement, but it's a bit clearer than many of those other privacy laws that companies have to adopt here. So it gives them, they appreciate that there's a standard now that is law in one part of the world, but can serve as a guideline also for other parts of the world. And even if this guideline is more demanding than legislation in their markets outside of Europe, it makes life easier for them to have one high profile standard than many different ones, because really this growing global privacy patchwork, as I call it, is really hard to handle. Yeah.
So the sentiment from disbelief changed a little bit to some appreciation towards the legal framework.
Yes. Not everywhere, but I did my best also, of course, to convince companies that lean data management makes life easier, especially when you're a small company, because when you start collecting data, of course, you still have a better grasp on what you collect and in which way you handle and store it. With which processes and rules. So it's much easier for a company to do that early on, and that's what I always try to tell them.
Understood. So you just touched upon it when you said small companies. Are these topics relevant for the big and the small companies both? Is it more challenging for one of them? How do you see that?
Well, it's hard to generalize. So my clients are mainly small and medium-sized companies based in the US, with only some clients in Europe, or sometimes only with the mere intention of soon expanding to Europe. But this privacy management strategy that I talked about has been found with bigger tech firms as well. I mean, the very big ones, of course, they have big legal teams, and they have also offices in Brussels. And so they were involved in the lobbying process in the EU for years. So they knew well in advance what's coming up, how to prepare for it, but also were influencing, of course, in this very long negotiation process that GDPR had. And so it's also true that compliance, because it involves time and money, is sometimes harder for small companies. But as I said, so it's hard to generalize. There are those small ones that benefited from GDPR because they set, particularly on this path to privacy by design, and they created products that are more privacy proof on purpose and made this their brand and their marketing asset. And then those that build privacy management software, for example, I mean, they benefited big time. They're growing like crazy, and that's really great because it makes compliance much easier, although it's sometimes a bit too easy, or but the software helps a lot, of course, and those companies, of course, have grown. And then, as I mentioned earlier, small companies also tend to have less data, which makes it easier and less costly to change and improve their data management, of course. So, but overall, I have to say that a lot of small ones have lost vendor contracts, which means that bigger companies would not contract with them anymore. For example, that for software that is integrated into the bigger company's software, because they could not guarantee GDPR compliance at the same level and at the same speed. Under GDPR, that's a liability problem also for the contract partner. So yes, that's a worry that's been expressed quite often, not only in Europe, but also here. And some of it is true for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And we now talked a lot about GDPR, and that's definitely worth it. Beyond GDPR, there are a lot of the regulation future is quite rich, and there are more regulations that are tech relevant. What do you see coming, or what are other regulations that you talk about with your clients and with your network?
Yeah, so first of all, GDPR is still a topic. Of course, not that craziness of early 2018 anymore. So when I get involved now to work on GDPR compliance, it's mostly for companies that only now look to Europe as a potential market to launch, because maybe they didn't even exist in 2018, or they were still too small. And when they start building up, for example, a partnership with a European company, or need to set up their GDPR compliant vendor agreements for that. So that's a big field still. Plus, now that the European Court of Justice has invalidated the data transfer framework between the EU and the US that many small companies relied on so far, this has given us a whole new challenge to work on, and that is making sure that those data transfers are still can still be done in a way that is compliant with European law. So yeah, that we still do that, and it's a lot. But the Commission has tabled 2 other proposals last December, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, and I believe both will have quite in the US, in a different way from GDPR, more likely just giving inspiration and a set of tools to test, like in a sandbox, because US lawmakers are thinking about the same issues, and they're trying to see what could work. We have a new administration here that is much more open to all these topics, and with Europe going ahead with strong regulation on platforms, gatekeepers, content moderation, US lawmakers definitely look and see what could work and what they could adapt as well, because there's quite some readiness, as I said, to go in that, maybe not that same direction, but just seeing what tools could work. And that is something that, for example, when you listen to Senator Amy Klobuchar and her antitrust plans, she openly says that she's very much inspired by what happens in the EU and is in regular contact with Margrethe Vestager. And so that's pretty interesting to see, which, I mean, just the last 4 years under President Trump was not noticeable. Well, what I'm mostly working on these days is the upcoming regulatory proposal that the Commission will table next month around trustworthy artificial intelligence. And that's a draft policy that is expected to be tabled to member states for negotiation, and that could, I mean, we don't know how long these negotiations will last, but once they are successful, this could be the world's first general regulation on AI. So I find that pretty exciting, because although, I mean, there's a lot to say about whether the proposed regulation will be enough or will it work, but you know, in AI policy, the big focus of the past years was principles. And we've seen important work done by the OECD in particular, but also UNESCO and other international bodies. and of course many national governments, everybody says that something has to be done and fast, because the technology is just advancing so fast. But now in 2021, I think we're at the stage of how do you transform these principles into practical rules and regulations. Yeah, so that's what I'm mostly working on.
Yeah, very exciting. And what would be in this regulation, what would you hope it addresses? If you would wish for 1 or 2 points that have to be in there.
Yeah, so well, first of all, there's an important point to make, and that regulation will most likely also mention that, and that is that existing laws already cover AI, but they have to be adapted. So you know, there's laws in consumer protection, on non-discrimination, data protection, of course, product safety, liability, and they apply to AI systems just the same. Consumers expect the same level of safety and respect of their rights, whether or not a product or system relies on AI. But these aspects that apply to AI are hard to implement, and it's not very clear how they can actually be enforced when you have a system that is, you know, pretty opaque, unpredictable, complex, and, well, above all, autonomous in many cases, or until a certain point. And so it's really important that lawmakers look at how to amend and update those laws so they very clearly cover AI as well, and so that we consumers don't have to care about whether a product contains a bit of AI or a lot, where that we just expect the same protection. But of course, beyond that, I'm pretty excited about the fact that so far, you know, most governments also in the US on state and local level have shied away from doing the actual work on a comprehensive and rights-based approach in AI. And, you know, just to have like a checklist, like in the US, you would call it an FDA approval list. You know, we have this, the Drugs Administration here that approves vaccines or medication, and something like that for AI would be, I think, the right thing to do, you know, to require human oversight, to require accuracy and robustness, resilience against attacks and manipulation, so the safety aspect. Also to make sure that training data sets are representative and comprehensive. That is a big point against bias as much as possible, and that they comply with data protection rules. Also, you know, this aspect that is in some smaller actually state laws here, but never on a higher level, that users need to be informed when they interact with an AI system and not a human, so that they know what the capabilities and limitations are of, you know, the voice that is speaking to them, or that's an important application. And for me as a privacy professional, of course, it's always super important to remind companies that data and record keeping is very important, and that is also in the case of AI important, so they can trace back AI decisions in case there's a harm or there's a complaint, so they can trace back why the system decided this way. And honestly, for me, I mean, it's not clear whether the Commission will propose that, but I wish for some tougher stance on facial recognition. The Commission will probably say, yeah, it has to comply with data protection rules and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And there are already quite important safeguards in there, but I would want to see more. And then also, I mean, I have to also say, I didn't mention that yet, all these requirements, the EU, the Commission foresees them only for high risk applications of AI, and what that is a whole different story. I think that the way they want to define high risk is not clear enough and doesn't cover enough because it's highly subjective what a high risk is. For some people, a low risk that perceived by others could actually be high risk for them, or also, individual risks is something completely different from collective risk. And so, in that sense, what I'm seeing there is not ideal, but what is important with it is that it will have a ripple effect on other regions of the world again. And that is the aspect that I find exciting, and not. It is a very European approach. It doesn't necessarily need to be right for every legal culture, but I'm a pragmatic, and so probably as a lesson learned from GDPR, I know that this would be a groundwork for a more intense public debate on how to regulate AI. And in that way, a first real life attempt at getting it right at quite a big scale, because I mean, the European Union is 27 countries, 450 million residents, and I'm sure that this will push other regions to find their own answers to this question about the policies we need for AI.
Thank you. And I like how you said that there are already laws in place, and that in a way consumers or users should know that the same laws apply no matter if they use AI or not. And my question for you is, humans are allowed to learn and use their learnings in the next situation. So I can learn from today and use my knowledge in my tomorrow's conversation. Do algorithms have the same freedom to take learnings, or do you see a risk there of confidentiality, personal data?
Well, that depends on how they're built. The exciting thing about AI is that it can take experience and mistakes it made and improve and improve and improve even more. So in a way, it's kind of like in some cases, depending on the application case, but I like to compare it to a small child doing one thing over and over again, and then you learn from your mistakes and you become better and better. But depending on what you see and what is shown to you, of course, this creates sometimes kind of a distorted view of reality, or what is wrong and what is right. Kind of like how children grow up in different circumstances, and I think it's there's a very high responsibility for engineers here, and I do assume that most build algorithms with the best intent and try to make them as good as possible. But of course, there's this problem about bias, of course, that is unconscious, and sometimes also companies, engineering teams don't put enough care into selecting their training data set. Then, yeah, and of course, I think it's important to always limit, not necessarily make the application cases small, but just to you need to define and beforehand what you want to achieve, and then you also have realistic goals of what AI can do for you in a certain application case. I think a lot of people also use this term very broadly and don't really have a clear understanding of what AI can do and what it can't. It does serve as an additional thinking capacity for humans. In many cases, that is super useful. I have high expectations for AI to help us in, mitigating the climate crisis, in making transportation more effective. So using less fuel, making agriculture, the use of fertilizers, much more targeted. All these things AI can do, and we need it as soon as possible. But I think these are applications where this checklist or approval process, how I imagine it, should be very fast. But then in other cases where human rights are involved, we should be very cautious and limit the cases first to see how they go.
Yeah, like you said, like a child, right? I really like this analogy. A child sometimes is biased, and sometimes a child doesn't know which part of a conversation maybe not to share with the neighbors the next day, and which learning is very fine to use in a different setting. So I like this analogy. And you talked about human rights and maybe a bit of a gap, but I saw that you're also supporting Food Watch, and you're active in this field. Is this kind of a personal passion, or is that linked to your job?
Well, it's not linked to my job because I started being interested in slow food, in the slow food movement, and you know, caring about healthy food, and especially up the food chain, healthy agriculture much earlier than this, actually from when I lived in Rome in 2005 to 2008. So that was slightly before getting into tech policy, but maybe there is a link. It's interesting that you're saying that, because so I think there are quite a number of challenges that we're facing right now, and I do like to work on things that matter. I don't need to tackle the biggest obstacles and the biggest challenges all at once, and I do think that the climate crisis is the biggest challenge to us humans. My strengths and skills apply best to the other crisis I see, and that is regulating technology in a way that serves human beings and human society, because we're in the process of getting overwhelmed with what we can do, and we should really. I'm not against that. As I said, we need some of that really fast, and it's fantastic, but we also need to see where we apply it and where we don't apply it. And I think so the slow food movement in its origins in northern Italy was really about going back to the roots of what can do and where global is harmful, and also working on diversity. So supporting local food, but also local species of, you know, certain pigs or certain plants that, you know, are actually represented in the local cuisine. And in that sense, there's another parallel. It's interesting that you're talking about this, because working with small and medium companies and in the field of AI policy, what strikes me most is that in AI, size clearly matters. The size of the company clearly matters. The size of the training data set clearly matters. And the more data you can gather, the better your AI system works. And so this experience with GDPR, you know, doing harm to the small players because they couldn't face the compliance costs. Regulation blocked them more than big ones in the beginning. It has this risk, and I mean, it's already there. It's not just a future risk. We are seeing it, that we're going to have monopolies in this field, where just the very few big companies gather so much data from their AI systems that they're just going to crush the others if there are no rules in place. And in the field of AI, this happens even faster than in the rest of technology industry. And so these monopolies, I mean, they they have the capacity to create better AI systems that serve people better, that they probably like better in the way they work, but also we need competition, and we need competition not only for innovation, which already is a very important point, but also because the power of those monopolies becomes almost unlimited when there are few players in the market.
Yeah, and I think that's a global question. If we say this is a global question that Europe and the US is jointly talking about, what goes wrong sometimes in these conversations, assuming that something can go wrong? Is it maybe miscommunication, different terminologies, different values? What's your experience?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're talking about differences, but honestly, looking at the rest of the world, Asia, talking about Asia first, because they're so strong in technology development, we have to say that the US and Europe have a lot in common, and that is mainly their political systems, and we can talk about differences a lot, but the belief in the rule of law, the belief in human rights, the belief in fundamental human rights, and then also just our democratic systems and the market economy, those are so important factors that keep us together, that it was pretty shocking for me in the past couple of years that there was so little conversation around these technology policy topics. And the previous administration here in the US was really more interested in keeping up in the arms race in AI, for example, towards China. And not talking about rules too much in order to not stifle innovation, which I think it's a double-edged sword, because in the end, I don't think anybody, at least also in the tech companies, wants to harm democracy, but there was too little talk about what actually is doing this to democracy. And so this has changed. The administration here has changed, and I think now there are really a lot of people in place, and also here in California. I mean, California, it's so far away from Europe, it's at the other end of the world, but there are a lot of political stances that are very similar, and I think that is better reflected now also at the federal level. What hinders the conversation is probably that both blocs are pretty much busy with themselves, not in general, but also just right now because of the economic impact of COVID-19. And also, just democracy being more frail than we expected it to be, maybe naively. And here in the US, the whole tech ecosystem is so strong, but it's really more looking at itself, and it's difficult to open up horizons, although people come from so many places in the world to work here. So I work with a lot of people from around the world. They're not just Americans, but this is just such a complex ecosystem here that it's hard to open up eyes about other places in the world. And in Europe, this is now judging from afar, you can probably better explain that, but I have the impression that on a European level, people are very busy coordinating between 27 member states and so many complexities, and Europe is a very diverse continent, maybe population-wise by far not as diverse as here, but just politically, so many different layers of policy making. And so I I think it's interesting that in the case of GDPR, I had the impression that the realization that this would have an impact on other places in the world came much later than I expected, because everybody was so busy figuring out how this would unify 27 countries. So I think it's, I mean, then of course there's legal cultures that are completely different, you know, code law and common law, that is a huge difference too. But I think it's mostly this, like the limited capacity of, you know, where to think first. Yeah. And so both are highly complex systems with different layers of policy making, and then democracy is complicated, but it's the best system we've so far found.
No doubt there. And I see we have a raised hand in the audience. Raimonde, you have a question.
Yeah, this is me. I was wondering, before you mentioned bias in AI systems. I was wondering, do you think bias can be overcome if you have large enough training data sets, or do you need regulation on top of that? And is it sort of, that it can't be avoided that there will be bias in the AI system, no matter how large the training data?
Well, that depends also on your definition of bias, of course. And that is, I mean, as much as I would wish for an international framework on AI, when you can't even define in our system what bias is, what an intended bias is, what an unintended bias is, and what fairness is, it's hard to completely eliminate bias. But I think so. Again, Esther, you liked my example with children, raising children. But I mean, I suspect it's just like when a small child, every time it goes to he or she goes to the doctor, sees a white man in a white coat, and that's the doctor. It's hard to explain to that child when it sees a non-white woman with a colorful scarf that this is a doctor too. And so this is unintended. It's just because the training data set is such. And we can do our best to make society and our other rules unbiased, and we should do that. And then on top of that, AI has the potential to overcome some of those biases. You know, when you eliminate that like old human brain that maybe thinks in a certain way that is not fair.
You can set the conditions yourself, right? You can create the environment,
yes,
that the AI learns from. Yeah,
exactly. But the problem is just the scale. So when you have one weird AI HR boss who doesn't like women, or and decides about, you know, recruitment in a certain way, that's, you know, one person. It's often hard to change that person, but at least the scale is pretty limited, and you can point to the mistakes in many cases. When you have an AI system, it's a higher scale, and it's much more difficult to detect the bias where it is. But as I mentioned, you have to have a definition of what is fair and what isn't fair. If what you want to achieve is fair in one society, it doesn't need to be considered fair in another one. And so, I mean, every legal culture has their own rules. I'm, of course, convinced that all humans are equal, no matter their gender, race, or sexual orientation, but somebody else could see that differently in another legal system. As I said, the problem with AI is that the scale is so much larger, and that it's really opaque. And I think one thing that would help already was if there was a system to improve, you know, the algorithm increasingly, as you know, the more mistakes you see or unintended consequences, the more you can repair it. and then direct it in a way that you want it to go. That is really important, but that needs accountability and supervision.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question for that. You also mentioned that the second biggest problem worldwide you see now is that of regulation. Do you feel that innovation and technology will sort of outgrow, well, is faster and is developing way faster than regulation can keep up with?
Well, of course, that's the case for all rule setting. You needed the invention of the car to, then come up with safety belts, and that took decades. In this case, things go much faster, and very often the people who, always nowadays, the people who decide about rules about rules on technology haven't grown up with that technology. So it's so recent that it's really hard to decide about things that you haven't even used that much yourself. I don't want to say this is unique, because lawmakers decide about many things they haven't used themselves, but then they have experts who write down things, and I don't want to say that tech is in any way special just because it's more complicated. It is it's an industry and products just the same, and they shouldn't believe, or the tech industry shouldn't believe, that they're in any way exempt from rules. But I do think that the tech industry will get far more government attention in the next 5 or 10 years than it did in the last 10. And we're going to have lots of court cases, investigations about different issues at this handful of companies that have this huge impact right now. And we're also going to have a whole wave of new rules. Probably tech isn't just being sued, now it's being regulated. And that is complicated. It's always a trade-off between many different desires. You want to be affordable, you want to have good quality, you want to be safe, you want it to be easy to use. And policy making is of course a compromise of all that, and to see what works for most people. And tech is in that way a bit special, because markets aren't separate. In this case, the network effects are global, and how do those those technologies follow local laws? That's almost impossible. And yeah, it's for the last 25 years, it's been mostly all just the US ideas of free speech and regulation and privacy law, or no privacy law, competition, but because that's where the internet came from, and also many thought that this isn't really important enough to go to legislation, but that's clearly changed. And so we're moving to a world of multiple overlapping regulatory spheres, and that's what I find really exciting as somebody who thinks internationally.
Yeah, I agree. This is a very exciting field to be working in right now.
Thank you.
Thank you for
and
that.
Gianfranco.
Oh, thanks, Esther, and thanks, Julia, for being with us today. I don't want to open a can of worms. You talk about many spheres of regulatory environments, and there is one we did not name much today, that is security. Mm-hmm. So it's perhaps the third leg of this stool of digital future, together with data and AI. As a 1-minute answer from your perspective from the United States, do you think Europe is doing enough from your point of observation? And if so, what would you like the US to learn from what you're doing in security as well?
Are you talking about information security of systems?
Both sides are relevant probably to this conversation. Yeah.
Oh, that's a huge field. We should have another session for that.
Sorry.
But yeah, I'm in a bit of a dilemma, you know, whether market forces or, you know, concern are better, and it definitely depends on the individual case. I do think that both sides have long overlooked this risk, and there I mean like really a security risk for people, for society, and they're only just waking up in some spheres. But we need to have clear rules about you know, how much we can actually isolate ourselves, or how much market powers should also have weigh in. I'm not taking any side here, but I do think that what the you know, the US and European tech companies are working on and offering help to work on security systems, and also in that way creating a new field of foreign and security affairs. It's really important to involve them in this and to accept their know-how, and to involve them also in the responsibility that comes with it, because I think that those companies have long been overlooked as important players, not only for the technology but also for our values. And I mean, a lot of those companies don't want to you know, be identified with a certain political system, but when you actually ask them deeply, like, what kind of society do you want, I do think they would be ready to take stance, and some of them are already. And then in that sense, I think they should also have the responsibility to do their part to protect the system that we cherish. And so I think we can't do it without the technology companies, but they really have to commit to that as well.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, it's a big topic. You're right. It's for next time.
So we will have you again. That's solved already. Are there more questions from the audience? Then I would like to wrap it up with one last question. We talked about, you explained to us the concept of trustworthy AI. We talked about the impact of European regulation on US. And maybe as a last question, what can Europe learn from the US, from what you see over there?
So I'm now saying something that a lot of people say, but I really see it on a daily basis when I work with companies here, also European founders who come here because they want to realize some, you know, dream of a business plan or an idea they have. It's a bit cliche, but it's really true that people here take more risk in anything, like even in daily life. And I'm, you know, I mean, I worked in public service. I'm kind of risk averse by nature. Plus I'm from Germany, but it's impressive how much you know, people can just be ready to try it out and not think about pitfalls. I mean, my job here is, interestingly enough, to be the one who, you know, helps them to scan consequences and find pitfalls before you tap into them. So definitely, my niche is being between the worlds and building bridges and helping those folks here think about future risk a bit more. But I think it's that mix that is important, and what I see a lot in Europe is just, you know, constant reminding of what could go wrong and never trying, and also to be all in when you try something, and just give it a go. And I mean, this failure culture, I think that is something that is highly debated. I wouldn't even say that it's something that people strive for here. Some pretend to because they failed, but I don't think it's anybody's wish, but just take it as a potential outcome of what you're doing, and this energy of just trying it out and taking a risk and see. And then of course, you know, I think that I bring some healthy Europeanness into the discourse here by saying, are you sure this is what you want? Why don't you think about potential problems? But a healthy mix is probably what can achieve most. And in that sense, I think Europe and the United States are just natural allies.
Great. I think we can take this attitude maybe forward for all of us. Thank you so much, Julia. It was great having you, super insightful, and I'm very happy that we already kind of scheduled you in for another talk. There seems to be much more to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And have a nice day.
For having me. Great fun.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you.